So as we begin this chapter talking about infants and early communication, a lot of the focus of our conversation really talks about the social foundation of language development and how infants really from the get-go are very driven to interact with people in their environment. That communication and their interest in communication is inherent right from birth, and lots of underlying variables that support that early communication. So when we think about the socialness of infants, what we're talking about this incredible inherent sociability. And so it's really something that we find young infants born with, and it's well established across cultures and communities that babies are driven to communicate. So some of the ideas related to the socialness in infants really provides the idea that the early exchanges that happens between parent and child really lay a strong foundation for later communication and language. And just as an aside, much of the conversation that we'll have in this chapter really talks about this idea of moms and babies, or we'll talk about maternal input and so on. And for those of you for our male counterparts or for dads that we're talking to, please know that that's not meant to be dismissive at all of the role of fathers in exchanges. It just means that a lot of the early research has been done with moms. Interestingly, and I talk about this in some of your notes, that Locke had a theory that was really kind of looked at a very different perspective of how communication is developed. And so we talk a lot about how babies are making noises and parents are assigning intentionality to it. But Locke has this whole theory, and it's sort of a seminal paper that was written, that maybe this whole language piece is just an afterthought related to what the baby's really driven to do. And so Locke's idea was that babies really, what they want is food and warmth and their pants changed and to sleep. But when they're doing things like crying because they're hungry or crying because of a wet diaper, parents are constantly assigning intentionality to those behaviors. Oh, you're so hungry, pairing words that match a different kind of pursuit. And some of his theoretical beliefs is that in these exchanges, babies are getting lots of practice of hearing these words. And so although the primary need behind all of their behaviors is really much more specific to getting basic needs met, language becomes something that's just a byproduct of those efforts and parent interaction. So just a kind of a different perspective on things. But when we think about what babies come to the table with, and you know this from your TED Talks, we really feel like there's a lot of behaviors that would suggest they have a predisposition to communicate. For example, some of the early research shows interesting things like the fact that babies really show a preference for speech compared to other kinds of noise. So you could sort of make the case that that strong interest and that strong favorability of speech is something that's inherent in the child. So research shows that babies enjoy speech over music, that if they're searching for different noises, they'll search more strongly for the human voice and have a preference for human voice over other kinds of noises or sound, and that babies can recognize and will show preference for their mother's voice over all others really right from the get-go as well. We also know that babies have lots of preferences for human faces. So some of the research shows that if you give babies, and again, we'll talk a little later about how they do some of this research, which is super interesting, but a baby will attend longer to an outline of a face with eyes that sort of represents more of an entire face versus a picture of just two eyes. So again, sort of this real interest in things that are very human-like. We know that even by 2 weeks of age, babies can recognize and distinguish their mother's voice from a stranger's voice. And some of this is interesting is that because we know at birth, a baby's vision is at best about 8 inches in terms of distance. And so that becomes sort of an interesting supportive early communication development too, when we think about breastfeeding and the distance between a mother's face and a baby when she's breastfeeding. That 8 inches is just about a perfect distance for them to be able to be really engaged with their mother during these really maternal kinds of moments. So one of the things your book talks quite a bit about is infant speech perception, and some other language development texts pull this out as a whole different content area. But there's interesting research that looks at how babies are even learning to figure out any kind of meaning within this connected piece of language. And so studies are looking at how infants are attending to prosodic characteristics, which is really talking about the frequency of sounds, the duration, and intensity. And we know that prosodic characteristics are combined in pattern ways that are different for different languages. And one of the theories about early language development is that maybe what infants have that really differentiates them from, again, other kinds of animal species is an incredible ability to attend to regularities and patterns in the data that they're receiving. And the data, of course, they're receiving is their native language. And so, for example, in the different languages, there's different stress on different syllables. In English, we have a strong, weak pattern compared to other languages that may have a different stress pattern. And that babies are also attending to intonation, which is the prominence on certain syllables reflected on the entire phrase or a sentence. So think about the difference between I saw her versus I saw her. So that intonation makes a completely different communicative message, obviously. And so part of the belief is that babies are really able to attend to some of these patterns within the language to be able to figure out where there are boundaries for words and phrases and clauses. Research shows that babies are also attending to the phonetic regularities within their language. And so, for example, in English, we're able to put, lots of languages have a consonant vowel consonant kind of combination, but think about some of our blends that we could put a BL and a GL together, but never an RL in terms of how words begin. And so, again, research shows that babies are attending to some of these regularities, which also helps them to be able to make sense of the input and be able to make connections to the native language that they're hearing. And some of this phonetic regularities, we've talked already in this class about this idea of categorical perception, meaning that, early on babies hear differences from almost any kind of variation with different phonemes, but that by about a year of age, research shows they're really starting to group like sounds together into one category of, say, R-ness or L-ness. And so babies are no longer hearing a difference between the sounds of P and the word pop, because obviously at the beginning of pop and at the end is quite different. One is much more aspirated, has much more intensity, but within our English language, those two different ways of producing the P sound aren't meaningfully different. And so babies have to sort of create these categories of sounds where they're ignoring these slight differences in the sound to make them make sense of sounds that are common and alike. And so that's all happening within that first year of life. So in terms of thinking about early social communication and some of this proclivity to really be attentive to these early social exchanges, we know that, babies will smile at 1 to 2 months of age when spoken to. So they're attentive to humans' voice. And we've already talked about their ability to recognize their mother's voice, but we also know that babies can recognize their mother's face and their smell. So they're really responsive to that person and their environment that has been most important. We know that babies will gaze at an adult face and vocalize. Babies are also attending to not just the face, but the sound that is being produced. So by 3 months of age, a human face in front of a baby without any kind of vocalization or speech will no longer hold that baby's attention, where earlier than that it often would. And then we also know that eye gaze is really an important early developmental component that supports early social communication. So mutual gaze is when the infant and the caregiver are looking at each other. And so face-to-face gaze is typically most often in this, although it may also be a shared object in the future. When we talk about joint attention, we'll talk a little bit more about that. A didactic gaze is the child monitoring, a mom's monitoring and following the child's eye gaze. And so parents are really attentive to this, to look at what's interesting to the child, and it's a really great early developmental skill, because when we talk about caregivers' response to what children are interested in, we know that's highly correlated with language development. And then gaze coupling is when the infant and the child tie in eye contact and sort of this turn-taking exchange. And so there's long alternating kinds of turn-taking that's happening with eye gaze in terms of early communication. In terms of the social role of early vocalization in infants, we know that moms can rate a child's vocalization within the first 2 weeks of life, meaning that they're really interpreting differences between a cry for hunger or a cry for being overtired, which is super amazing how attentive parents are to their children. And again, moms are interpreting this child's intent. Obviously, the child isn't necessarily specifically and purposely crying in different ways, but mothers are able to perceive these differences that are inherent with the child are doing. And what the babies are doing really makes the interaction different as well. So we know, again, from research that babies that vocalize more with more speech-like sounds in their early vocalization are rated as more fun in research, which has looked at how people might rate babies, which is kind of interesting. And then in terms of these exchanges, when adults are imitating babies' vocalizations, we know that the 3-month-old sounds and their vocalizations sound more speech-like than when an adult is not imitating a baby. We know by 3 or 4 months of age, they're more likely to respond with vocalization when a caregiver responds verbally, so they're really matching what the caregiver is doing. And by 12 weeks of age, vocalizations are sequential, meaning that there's this turn-taking in vocal exchanges that's happening versus mother and child vocalizing at the same time. So lots of importance in terms of the early social exchanges in the vocalization of mother and child. Turn-taking is a term that you probably are all familiar with and will continue to talk about right up through adolescence in terms of talking about pragmatic skills. But turn-taking is developing really within the first, some people talk about it almost from birth, but that it begins when a baby starts breastfeeding, because we see a baby breastfeeding, stopping, feeding more, stopping, sometimes moving off the breast, looking at mom. So those are all early turn-taking exchanges. The gaze coupling in terms of sharing that gaze back and forth is another form of turn-taking. And it really, these turn-taking exchanges early on provide a foundation of later discourse. We call it proto-conversations. But the fact that a baby is realizing in these mostly nonverbal exchanges early on that each person is taking a turn and there's a waiting while that other person takes a turn lays the foundation for early communication skills. Early on, turns are really short and they're both verbal and nonverbal. And we know that parents do a nice job of providing pause time for an infant to be able to take a turn in some of these early vocalization exchanges and really accept anything as a turn in terms of the child responding. We know that as time goes on, the anterior increases, that the adult is expecting more from the child, so they just don't take like an eye gaze response as the actual turn for the child. We see parents and babies moving into more things like routine games, like pat a cake and so big and gonna get ya. And those are all obviously really turn-taking in their nature. And in a lot of these exchanges, the adult is assigning attentionality, meaning that they're interpreting a child's behavior like they're doing something purposeful to facilitate the engagement, where a lot of this is a little bit just more responsive early on. But as we talk about intentionality here shortly, we'll talk about how this early assignment of intentionality is really teaching children about what intentionality is.